just 1 second. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of AUA, Ask Us Anything. And welcome, Josh.
Wholeness, Denny, what's going on? How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good. This one I didn't really have to prepare. You did all the preparation work, which is great.
Most of it.
Yeah. So the idea here is that if I count my fingers, we have done 63 episodes of our weekly practice. Another 63 weeks of our weekly practice in English. So we actually started in the very beginning of 2020, in January timeframe, actually before the country kind of shut down. And of course, then after that, we did it very consistently. And so we thought that maybe this would be our annual review, to kind of talk about what we have done and so forth. And so this is going to be a bunch of questions. Most of them were asked by Josh, and some of that was asked by some students that I summarized. So the title of today's talk is Mindful Practice of Body, Chi, and Mind. So now just keep in mind that this is already a slight deviation from our original teaching, which is mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of the feeling, mindfulness of the mind, and then mindfulness of the body. So we're actually taking a slightly different approach, and I'll talk about why that is. Much of that has to do with just my own practice versus the needs of my students. And so we are kind of taking the mindfulness of body and kind of expanding it into the mindfulness of body, chi, and mind.
And we'll also talk about some of our personal experiences with practice.
That's really the point. That's really the point. So this reflects our personal experience. Yeah.
If there is a personal experience, right? So.
Oh, there is. There is.
On one level.
Yeah. So, so that's general summary and overview. So why don't you take this one?
Yeah, this is a question I came up. Even with this too. How many sessions have you missed? You've only missed a couple, right? A few every day since then, right? And then also we'll just tie it in with this question that's on the screen now. What are the common themes that you've noticed in the past 62 weeks that come up during practice? And you've touched a little bit of that. So.
Well, one of the theme for the last 62 weeks is that because of the pandemic, we were forced to stay home, and so we don't really have a venue anymore to get together practice. Now, given that we never did with the English one, right? So this is actually, the English one is actually a reflection of what we do with the Cantonese version of that. And the Cantonese version is essentially non-stop, at one point 7 days a week. At one point it was 7 days a week. And now we have the Saturday devoted to the English, and Sunday I kind of take a day off because I wanted to reserve that for eventually when we can go back to our prison work. But so essentially we have 5 days of Cantonese practice, and then 1 day of English practice, both the morning and the afternoon. Now the afternoon, of course, came much later, but the morning one, we started pretty early. So the theme, number one, is in the beginning, it was just a place for people to relieve their initial shock and stress due to the shelter in place. So we actually have a very different set of students in the very beginning. A lot of people just got stuck at home. And so the English class in the beginning was actually quite popular with that new set of students. Now, I remember at one point, one of the students asked if we could bring in, if she could bring in her mom, who actually doesn't speak English. And so then we started the bilingual was actually kind of weird that we start English first and then became bilingual, and then eventually the Cantonese class took over, and then we went back to English only on Saturday. So the theme is the progression of theme. The initial one was just taking care of people's very obvious needs of having to have a place to practice to relieve the stress and the anxiety. And then I think that lasted a few months, and then things start to open up, and people start to understand how they can go back to quote unquote normal life. So a lot of the students were also professionals, in terms of healing, doing all kinds of physical therapies and so forth. And so they eventually find a way to go back to work because they're now considered essential workers. And so that initial wave of students kind of dissipate. And I don't remember even having a single one anymore from that initial batch. Then it kind of, as it became the Cantonese, then then we have a group of what I always call the small army of Cantonese speaking grandmothers. And my mom become sort of the surrogate student for me because around that time my dad was having a lot of issues with his health, and my mom was always been the caregivers, but now become much more intense and full time, and so she started to have a lot of physical pains and so forth, and so our practice started to gear towards fixing those physical pains as opposed to just like a spiritual practice. And so the idea of qi, the idea of the 12 energy lines, the yin and the yang start to come together. And then over time, that sort of became the theme. And then so at the end of last year, then we tried to get back into having more English students because for a while, all of the English students were just Cantonese-speaking students who were capable of speaking English. And it was kind of strange because we actually had a class that everybody was able to speak Cantonese, but we kind of artificially made it into English class, even though the students are the same. And we tried different things to kind of open up that forum. We had some initial experiment with Zoom. They started having this on Zoom platform, but it turned out not to be so successful. And then I was Josh, you were the one that suggested to me, that encouraged me, prompt me to, hey, how about this thing called the Insight Timer? Because we and I both know that this is a good tool for our own practice. But around that time, they started to have these video live casts. So I applied for it. I remember you told me, and I applied right away. But then it took time for them to eventually went through the orientation. So by early part of this year, we were able to start using the platform, and then that just opened up the floodgate. And so, like, I remember Josh, you and I were talking about now we're finally preaching to the choir. And so now, after probably close to, I'll say almost 20 weeks now of having our Saturday practice done on the Insight Timer and then live stream on both YouTube and Facebook, we have close to 350 students between the two classes. And actually, the students are very generous. They know that we are raising money essentially for MAPA, Mid-America Buddhist Association, and they were very generous donating money to us. Even, Insight Timer takes a pretty big cut. But on the other hand, we got everything for free. And so the idea that the thing has evolved. And so right now we kind of focus on this three things, so there's three things that really makes up for what I would call health as opposed to just being unsick. Unsick is sort of the Western concept of healthy, which is, go to the doctor if you're sick and he will make you unsick. But that's a very different concept of being healthy. And so in our concept, the healthy is really being healthy both in the physical domain, this physical body being very healthy. And then the other one is being in the energy domain, the energy dimension, which is the chi dimension. And then finally, it's we'll get towards the end, it's also the mind. So I think we have over the last 62 weeks or so, we have to kind of develop a pretty nice platform, I say. Yeah.
Yes, indeed so, and that goes along with the next slide, what you just wrapped up there with our goals, and
Yeah.
joining with Denny, I mean, maybe this is off, but I just noticed so much fear when we first started, so this was so important. And then one thing Denny's also done for part of it is the Metta practice, the loving kindness practice, which is just so lovely. It's such a protective practice as well, and it brings in deliberately attention on good energy and just friendliness and wishing people well, and that helps with the whole fear thing. And now I've noticed how maybe it was our practice that helped transform some of that fear, or maybe it's just people have gotten more accustomed to how things are now, or maybe a combination of the two. And when I joined first, I was going like maybe every day there for a little bit, I want to say. And also, I even joined one of the Cantonese only classes that was able to go along as well. And
Yeah, and you were actually improving your Cantonese quite a bit.
which is not hard to do when you don't know zero. I know Shifu. I know that's one, right? So
Well, you're improving on your Cantonese almost as well as my mom is improving on her English because she comes on Saturday, which is amazing.
yes, isn't it?
She just comes on Saturday too, and she just follow.
And it's great because it's a visual thing. So if you're a visual learner, there's not much of a language or as much a language barrier anyway. So you can just follow along visually, right, and you get a lot of
surprisingly,
anyway.
surprisingly, it's the same as like going to I'll tell a story. So one time I brought my son who doesn't really speak that much Chinese, definitely doesn't read. I brought my son to Taiwan for like a 3-day kind of Buddhist practice where you just like other than the couple hours that you sleep at night, it's all chanting and all that. And I look over and he was having a great time. And I couldn't understand why, because he doesn't understand the language. And it's just like you said, Josh, sometimes the having full utilization of your faculty, your ear, your eye, is actually a distraction. It's actually a distraction. So come back to the slide goal. So I will talk about my personal goal, and hopefully much of that aligns with Josh's own other goals, and I think we do. My personal goal is we have a pretty robust Sangha for the Cantonese speaking. It's surprising that it hasn't grown that much. It's just very hard for people to just come and practice every day like that. But we have grown. We have grown. The good news is that we haven't lost a single customer. So, it took a long time to add one, and then we don't lose one. So that's having been a businessman, I know that's important. But this the Cantonese one has a life of its own that is serve a community, and I think when the neighborhood temple opens up, now we really get to be more exposed to the other Cantonese students, then that takes on a life of its own. The thing that I focus more is really on the English speaking, the Saturday one, and I want to go back to the evolution. So we started in Saturday morning, and so of course Saturday morning is great for people in North America, right? Because it's 8 o'clock, so it's only 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the East Coast. And it's good for people in Europe. So it's actually late evening for them. So it's great. So we actually get a lot of students from the European countries. But it's very, very tough for the people in Asia. So of course, a lot of students says, when are you going to do an evening class? And I know why. I know why. Even for us, sometimes it's just hard for us to juggle. So having an evening class was good. But then I didn't want to just have another evening class, because then I having been in business for a long time, I don't believe in consumer choices. It's like the Costco idea. Don't give them too many choices, because then they have a hard time to choose. So I didn't want to make the morning and afternoon to be identical. And then somehow this idea came because one student actually came and he says, "Hey, I'm actually a caregiver for my brother, and a long story." So I said, "Well, how about we create another class in the afternoon, 6 o'clock, which turned out to be perfect for the people in Asia. And so the morning and the afternoon now has its own characteristics. The morning tend to be much more, I would say, like dynamic, much more energetic. So we sit for 30 minutes and then we stand for 30 minutes. And then, for those who want to follow, we do this I Ching Jing, for the lack of a better word, is the mother of Qigong. Very intense, very, very, very energetic. And then we sit again. So by the time we finish, it's hour and a half. By the time we finish it. So the evening class is all sitting, which turned out to be great for the elderlies. And it's great for the people who are bound to chairs or wheelchairs or bed or whatever. And it's great for people who are caregivers who are trying to learn something that they can then use for their endeavor. But because we can't sit, we can only sit. So we can't put all the stuff in that 1 hour. The side benefit of that is that we actually have a little bit more time, and it's a little bit more leisurely. And what that means is that we can then focus more on the mind. By the time in the morning, by the time we're done with all the little movements, we really don't have time to work on the mind, right? And so as things evolve, the afternoon class tend to be more and more on the mind. And I like to continue to do that. And I think that the thing that Josh mentioned about, leaving some room for the metta, and then and which by the way is really, really important for both caregivers and caretakers, care providers as well as care receivers. Because I know for a fact that, for example, my dad is suffering both diabetes and dementia. But the hardest part is not even the body. The hardest part is just deal with all that emotional pain. And so this is a common theme, because if the overall theme of our morning afternoon practice is about healing, self-healing. And I think one of the things you said, Josh, was very good in that if you just let your body be free, it will heal by itself, because all animals, all species in the animal kingdom is capable of self-healing. And so what we're doing is, by working on the chi and the energy line, is really allowing the body to heal itself. And then all we're doing is taking a logical extension of that to say, hey, how about healing of the mind? And healing of the mind really starts with trauma. That we all have trauma. And now if you take that further, these are trauma from the past, even from your past life. So the Buddhist teaching, we taught that karma. But karma is essentially karmic trauma. And so how do you heal that? And so this idea of metta, and we did that a few times, and I think we will continue to do more and more as really like the closing parentheses on the afternoon practice, is to bring out that metta. So that would be my personal goal, and I think that I'm using Josh, as a reflector to making sure that I'm on the right path. And I think that more or less coincides with your goal as well, doesn't it?
It does, and these are all. That's why I'm, involved in this. And
Yeah.
Denny will patch me in on the insight timer things through audio, through Zoom, so we kind of get away with that. I don't know if you call it getting away with it, but I chime in at the end and we take questions on Saturday. And yeah, the metta, because everything starts with the mind, right? The first line of the Dhammapada, the translation I like, is all phenomenon is preceded by mind, led by mind, and made by mind. So that it all starts with the mind as well. However, we have to, the mind is rooted in the body too. But the great thing about these Brahma Vihara practices, these heart quality practices like metta and compassion too, these are really important just to tie everything together. And I think a forgiveness practice is interesting as well. So, we can forgive others who have wronged us or perceive that have wronged us. So and then we can ask for forgiveness from them. And we can also forgive ourselves too. And only when it's time and feels right, to the extent that we feel like we can do it authentically, right? So there's a whole other practice for that as well. And that just, it's not so much for the other person, it's almost like taking a burden from us that we carry around like a grudge. I know I've held grudges in the past with people, but it doesn't do anything towards them. But when we can forgive, and it's just like setting that burden down because we don't need to carry that anymore. I think that's another healing of, body, spirit, and mind and energy as well. So yeah, and Denny, in the physical aspect is very important because I pretty much quit doing like a weekly yoga practice that I had, and this has taken the place, and I find this just as helpful, if not more helpful, than just a regular asana yoga practice. Not to actually at the beginning, and we still do a few exercises that are really similar to yoga, and Denny and I have talked about how yoga ties in to this, and also we've got that planned for the part of the rest of the show here too. So
yeah. So coming just briefly coming back to kind of take some of what you said and kind of emphasize it a little bit. Coming back to this idea of being a caregiver. So my mother-in-law passed away, as you know, and so now out of the two sets of parents, two have passed away, and now only my parents are left. And so my kids came home for the funeral, and other cousins came home, and more than one of them came up to me, and the one I can talk about is my daughter and her boyfriend came up to me separately on their own and says, "Hey, I really learned a lot about how you and mom take care of your parents. Take care of the grandparents, the compassion and the loving kindness that you show." And so at one point I explained that, and this is something, again, about the goal is to really, hopefully, taking what we learn and eventually find a community or fellowship of caregivers and care receivers, and really take what we do and kind of using the business term is vertically market, vertically package for that, and so I am of the opinion that if you think of your responsibility as a caregiver as a responsibility or a service, that is going to be very, very tough on you. It is going to be very exhausting, and eventually you will burn that candle because you are burning it from all ends, and it would extinguish, and it's a very, very tough thing. So statistically, those who are caregivers have a very high probability of themselves being the reverse, because it's so emotionally draining. So my experience, and this is again my goal, is to try to convince people that they need to think of the caregiving as a spiritual practice. That this is in fact a practice. It is the ultimate practice of metta, right? But not so much metta as in giving, but metta as in receiving, which is kind of weird because as you are providing care for someone, you are actually providing care for yourself. So when we talk about forgiveness, the prerequisites for forgiveness is tolerance. And you have to learn to be tolerant of your own pain and your own shortcomings. So one of the, I don't want to talk too much because there's so much that we can talk about, but when we talk about goal, and for example, I like to think that 62 weeks from today, we'll be in a place where we have a fellowship of caregivers and care receivers who can really treat this as a spiritual practice. And we're basically doing all the same thing, the sort of the physical practice, the physical exercise, the physical fitness, is to strengthen our body, strengthen our family's body. Then the chi is another aspect of that, and then finally the mind. So but ultimately one has to really think of this as a spiritual practice.
Yes, and this is a great platform too for something like that because we're not segregating out the caregivers and the care receivers, right? They're both of those demographics are join us on Saturday evening as well, right? And it's so powerful because it's not draining there; it's recharging.
The new
Both,
the new
yes.
term the new term is called care partners.
Ah, okay.
So you cannot really think of it as giving and receiving. You really have to condition and educate yourself, both of you, as partners. Okay, because otherwise it's like it would be like it's clashing. So number one is that it's clashing. Okay, much of the pain that the caregiver receive is they care too much, and then the care receivers are saying, wait, I can't do all that, right? That's one. The other one is, in addition to crashing, is that you're both diving. So the person who needs care is already at the bottom of the pit in terms of the emotional pain. And now if you can't control your own pain, and the best you can do is you dive in, and you can't help someone when you're both at the bottom of the pit. So
That's right.
anyway,
Instead of diving down, we
yeah.
want to lift them up, right?
We want to
And
lift
th-
them up. We
and
want to
then
we want to find that firm ground.
that's right, and care for ourselves too,
Care for
because
ourselves. So it
wait,
has to start from within.
yes,
It
it
has to
is
start
because
from
we
within.
can't take care of anybody else. We
Yeah,
talk about this
yeah,
all the time.
yeah.
Yep.
Now,
And
now,
then,
for
real
those who
quick,
are
the other,
listening, I
yeah.
just want to add that Josh has been the caregivers in the past.
Yeah,
Yeah.
somewhat.
So you're not speaking from vacuum entirely.
That's right. My
Yeah.
grandmother, I visited her. I definitely not as intensively as Denny, but she was on a very strong painkiller for many, many years. Her bones were deteriorating from osteoporosis. And my other grandmother did suffer dementia too. So the things that Denny have experienced, I've some similar experiences as well. Also, I wanted to say the other two Brahma Viharas, which are kind of neglected more, is the sympathetic or empathetic joy, because it's good to have joy for other people's joy. That's, you talk about brightening one's spirit and lifting up when we get a chance to be happy for other people's happiness, which is the most challenging one for me. But then equanimity too, that we realize that, okay, this is like a grandfatherly love where I've seen this, been there, done that, and I really want to care. However, we notice that there is past actions involved from the people, and that they're who are caring about, and they're also responsible for their actions, right? And we're not responsible for their actions, but we can still
Yeah.
care
No,
on a
yeah.
balanced level. So
Yeah. So one of the things I talk about in the past is having worked in the prison for a little bit over a year and a half, of course, before 2020, before the epidemic. One of the things that I was so impressed and so humble is the number of people who are volunteering. So the San Quentin prison where I was volunteer have somewhere between 4,000 and 4,500, maybe even less, prisoners, inmates, separate into three groups. About 700 of them are people who are on death row, because it's only prison in California, and California still has death row. So that's a big part of the populations. And then the other part, the people who wear the orange color, they're the revolving door. They come in for 6 months and then they leave. So that's called the reception. That's very violent. And then the middle are the permanent residents. They're basically there for life, or life with possibility of parole. So it changes the dynamic, because they have a chance to be paroled. So they are going to work hard. And so we are actually very welcome. I don't want to talk about that too much. What I want to talk about is I am so amazed by the number of volunteers. There are actually more volunteers registered than there are inmates. There are like close to 5,000 volunteers registered. And on Sunday, we have to wait in line to get in, because there's so many different groups. Now, so you have to ask, what drives people to volunteer in such an adverse environment? Well, of course they want to do good, but in addition, they feel good. They actually feel good. So this is coming back to what Josh said, is that if we practice the four immeasurables, it's the compassion, love, it's the loving kindness. Loving kindness is metta, the compassion, the empathy, empathetic joy, and the equanimity. So these are the things that we want to introduce to at least to our afternoon class, step by step. Okay? All right. What has been done? We kind of covered that, didn't we?
Yes.
Okay. Challenges and rewards. Okay. We talk about that too, I think. Rewards is
A little bit, yes.
think about it. I think of it as my spiritual practice, so the reward is immeasurable. We happen to pick up a few bucks. We're actually getting paid at minimum wage now on a Saturday practice.
And we've talked about the challenges with language barriers and things being shut down, and yes, yep. So, but there hasn't been, we haven't really been challenged really hard, which is interesting. I don't feel. Or
I mean,
it's a lot of time involved. I know.
Look. If there is no challenges, then there's no reason for anything.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. That's right.
So it's a good kind of challenge. It's just like we always talk about the good kind of pain. So that's we talk about that.
That's where growth comes from. Yeah.
Okay. So Josh has a bunch of questions. So
like always, right? Or like usual.
Go ahead. What's your question?
Oh yeah. So this was I remember Denny talking one time about. I've got more elaborate notes here, but he talked about Metta being mindfulness of mind, and I was like, this is really interesting. I haven't really heard of this before. Denny, do you know what I'm talking about here?
Oh yeah, I do.
Okay,
so let's talk about So let's talk about I hear echo. Yeah, I don't know why. You turn yourself off. I think you turn off your voice.
Yeah, I muted the microphone. Are you still getting echo?
Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so I want to go back to what we meant by mindfulness of the body, right? So I want to talk about mindfulness to begin with. So what is mindfulness? So if you go back to the very original translation, which is like the very end of the 19th century, it was actually an accurate translation in that mindfulness just means memory, just means remember. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else. So the word mindfulness, the Sanskrit word or the Pali word is sati. Sati. Sati is the name of a princess who was born as a princess, but he's actually a goddess. And when he became the daughter of the king and the queen, she made them took a vow that they would never disrespect her. As it turns out, when she grew up, she married Shiva, and which against the who's not considered very high caste, so the parents, the royal parents, disinvited them to their birthday party, and so Sati came and reminded them that they should. They had promised, they had vowed not to disrespect her, and then she jumped into the fire, and then eventually became a goddess again, and then eventually reborn as the second wife of Shiva. And we'll come back to that because there's one question that is related to Buddhism versus the North Indian religion that the Shiva comes back, or by that time he's named Parvati. Anyway, the word sati, by the time Buddha was using the word, it just means remember. You remember something and you commit to your memory. In fact, sati is the name of a ritual where when the husband died, the wife would jump into the fire with him because she is so dedicated to her spouse. That's all sati means. It's just remember. And so, how do we use the word mindfulness in the practice? So when we use it in the practice, it's called sati patanya. Patanya means foundation. Okay, so therefore we have what we call the four foundations of mindfulness. That's four ways that you can use, four that you can use to remember, to really understand where your mind is. So we have to understand that it's for us. It's like I used the example back in the days when I first came to the country. United States, people had just started to transition from a manual transmission to automatic. Okay, and so you see a lot of people, especially the older guys, would drive with 2 feet because they grew up with driving a manual transmission. So they have to, nowadays our left foot just sits right. So you would see cars driving down the street with the brake lights on because they're tapping on the brake light. That's the habit of driving.
I think it
Now,
was the foot clutch. Yeah.
yeah. So you're still getting echo. I don't know why.
Oh.
I hope that doesn't come out on the recording. So you might have to temporarily mute yourself. Okay, so the idea is that a mind and a body is not of one. A body does something and a mind does something else, right? So the classic is when people talk about, oh, I can multitask. I multitask. Well, actually, that's a fancy word saying that your mind is nowhere to be found. You're not focusing on anything. Okay, so a mind and a body is like a left foot and a right foot. They're not coordinated. It's as if you're driving the car with, full acceleration and full brake. That's how our body works. And so the very, very, very beginning of your practice has to be mindfulness, always remembering where your mind is. Now, of course, we can go further and talk about why that is. So that's enough to say that that's a mind. So for the original definition of mindfulness is just that. It's just a practice so that you know where your mind is. So there are 4 places where you could do that. And there's the mindfulness of the body. Now, in this case, the body is actually Kaya, Kaya, which are the 6 sensors. The 6 sensors. Okay, the 6 sensors are eye, nose, tongue, ear, body, and the mind. So most people don't understand that, and they think that the mindfulness of the body is just the body. No, the mindfulness of body is in fact the mindfulness of the form, all your physical faculty. Now, Master has actually talked about that, and he actually says that, I remember I wrote something along that line where he said, there is no mind. In other words, as a human being, as a physical living organism, the only time that we know where our mind is through its effect on the body. And the only way that we could manipulate our mind is again through the faculty. So after I heard that, and I said, well, you know what? This is exactly how we teach gravity. Is that there is no gravity. There is only the effect of gravity. And that's why when Newton discovered quote unquote gravity, it's just that he discovered the effect of gravity. And that's why by the time it gets to Einstein is able to rewrite all that because no one has ever seen gravity. It's just like no one has ever seen the mind. So Master's teaching is very clear that you have to start with the body, okay? And then even when you go from body to feeling, it's about the bodily feeling. And he actually says some point that the mind part of the feeling and the mind is completely outside of realm. It's outside realm. This is when Buddha was teaching entities that are outside of what are called the karma realm. Okay, and then now when you finally get to the mindfulness of Dharma, that's even more difficult to understand because Dharma in this case is really consciousness. It's really the 7 and the 8 consciousness, the alaya and so. So that's even further out. And so a lot of times it's a mistake, and I see that all the time, that they think of this 4 foundation as if they, it's a checkbox. And they just say that, okay, we got to go through the body. Okay, we're done. And then we go to the feeling now, and that's a very dangerous practice because when you think of the body as opposed to thinking of the body as the Kaya, which includes your brain, and you don't spend enough time and training on how you're mindful of your brain, then you go to the feeling, and now this is dangerous. This is actually very dangerous, right? And so that's one. And so Master never actually talked about the mind part, except he just very briefly mentioned that there are other practice. For example, chanting Amita Buddha. And he just mentioned very briefly that like the practice of the 4 immeasurables, That would be mindfulness too, even though they don't use the word, but it would be closer to the mindfulness of the mind. Okay, so the four immeasurables against it is metta, which is loving kindness, which is the beginning, and then the compassion and the sympathy and equanimity. Now, when we have a chance, we'll talk about the four immeasurables. The four immeasurables can be think of as a conduit for practice, or they can be think of as the result of a practice. So we talk about Zen, which comes from the word Chan, which comes from the word Chan Na, which actually is jhana. And jhana, on one level, it means sentimentations. How do you take your negative energy and just let it settle? Because the reason you let it settle as opposed to try to filter has to do with your karmic trauma. If you believe that your karmic trauma is of limited quantity, then you can filter. But if you believe that your karmic trauma is immeasurable, that there's so much of it that you can't, there's no possibility of filtering, then the best you can do is let it sink, let it sentimentation. That's what jhana means on one level. And another level is that it also means the four level of practice that are beyond the karma realm. And so as you practice your meditation, you actually get to a point where you're outside of your body. And later on, we talk about, where does all these yin and yang come from? And that's related to that. Then you start to see the effect of your practice. And the first one is actually metta. Then is, compassion and so forth, right? So those are, in fact, pure mental qualities. Because by that time, you have no use for your body. You already emancipated your body, right? Yeah. So it kind of makes sense for me that this is sort of related to the mindfulness of mind. Yeah.
It does, now that you say this. The other thing that came up is, the heart mind in this question. So, I can see where it's both the heart and mind. And however, now I know that, am I right that the Asian perspective of heart and mind is kind of a little bit different than the heart and mind perceptions that Westerners usually have?
This is a really, really good question. And I will say this, in the Western culture, we have this thing called the Renaissance, right? And it's from the Renaissance that we have all the Western science and the Western medicine, okay? And so now there's a couple of reasons for that. The Renaissance came after the Dark Ages, okay? And so, but in the transition, it was still done under the control of the church. And so Galileo is an example of someone who proposed something that violate the teaching of the church, and for that he was house arrest until his death, right? And so that history of focusing on just the physical science and leaving the mental science to the church, that's the tradition, okay? Related to that is the idea that the Europeans were under this control, this mind control for so long, more than 2,000 years. I mean, think about it. It started with the Roman Empire, right? Then after Christ, it took a long time before it became the Catholic Church, and so and so forth and so on. And the church was very, so it had almost 2,000 years of dark ages where we don't have free thoughts. Now, this never happened in Asia. We never had that. Okay? And so what happened is that once they got out of that dark ages, the intellect becomes important because they never had a chance to exercise the intellect. Okay, so the idea that everything has to come from the mind, right? And in this case, the mind means the thinking mind. In their case, the mind actually means the brain. Okay, that means the brain. So in the Western culture, when you translate the Heart Sutra, it really should be called the Mind Sutra, because that's what the mind is, right? That's what the heart means in the Western culture, because that's all they. That's why the Western medicine, we talk about this before the show, is that it has limitation because it's only about the body and nothing else, right? It's only about the dead body, even, right? Now, when you look at the other side in the Asian culture, the mind versus the experience are equally important. Equally important. So for example, last Saturday, I don't think you were there, or maybe you were, but I was doing the energizing of the energy point or something like that, and immediately one student, and I think he was even there for the first time, he immediately asked a very long question. He says, "Well, what if I do one here and one here? Would that be better?" All right. And so in the back of my mind, I'm just laughing, but I didn't want to say anything. But this is very Western. It's very Western that that they completely discard experience. That this is all about intellect. I can think this one better than you can. So I tried this and it works for me. What's wrong with this? As opposed to saying, well, if the person is teaching something from experience, let me just see if it works for me. If not, I will develop my own experience as opposed to intellect. Okay. So the idea of a culture that is based on intellect versus a culture that has the yin and yang, the balance between both intellect and experience. And again, understanding that the intellect comes from the brain and the experience comes from the spiral cord. Think about it. Every single nerve ending ends in the spiral cord, not in the brain. Okay, so I talk about the samurai, but let me talk about the professional basketball player who has to shoot that last 3-point or 2-point. I don't know the game well enough, but the game is tied, and he has to shoot that one penalty shot. He is not using his brain. He is what's called in the zone, because he's completely in sensory mode. He's completely not blocked out from everything else. He's just completely focused on that, not using his brain. So the difference between the brain and the experience and the idea of the mind, this is probably, I forgot the original question, but which happens to me a lot.
No, the original question, yeah, the Western versus the Eastern.
Yeah, the Western versus the
perception
Eastern.
of heart and mind, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So why
bigger,
does that
stronger
word? Why does that single word translate into mind versus translating into heart? Right? Because so one reason that it translates into mind in the Western culture is because that's all we have in the Western culture. It's all about our intellect. It's all about the mind. The heart is just an organ. It doesn't think. Right? Now, the Eastern culture is very different. Remember, we talk about the heart actually is separate into the heart versus the pericardium. Right? The pericardium is the mechanical function of the heart. The heart energy line, it has to do with more the thymus gland. So that actually controls our emotion and our thought process. And so that makes sense that in the Eastern culture, they translate that single word into heart, because it encompasses both your intellect and your experience.
So it's called, some people just combine those two words with a hyphen or dash, is it?
Yeah.
Heart mind, the heart
Which
mind.
is okay. It differentiates from the brain. Now,
That's right.
It differentiates from the brain, right?
So in Western culture, mind can mean, some people think that's synonymous with brain, and heart is not only a physical organ, but it can also mean kind of the emotional qualities, our emotional experiences.
It is actually very, very much the emotional part. It's very, very much the emotional part.
And not only that, feeling too. So like the actual visceral sensations of our experience, like, without the overlay of different perceptions on them too, just how it feels in the body, painful, pleasant or unpleasant as well, like the Vedana.
Yeah, so that's right. So expanding on that, again, going back to the Western science, Western medicine, is that there's a causality, there's a cause and an effect. So the cause, so if I'm upset of someone, it's because that someone appeared in my vision, right? If that person didn't appear, I wouldn't be upset. Okay, so the idea of the causality is that the external stimulants causes internal reaction, which is what we call our emotional reaction, right? The Buddhist teaching is not that. The Buddhist teaching actually that's why the word dependent origination. So no one ever explained that word well. How is that different from causality? Because causality just means that if you have A, you have B. Right? At most, it would be because in order to get to B, you must have the right condition. But it's a very strict path. I tell you, no one explains that better than Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong has a writing, I grew up with it. It's called On Contradiction. No one explains that better. That you have to have the right condition, the right stimulus to have the right result. It's a materialistic, right? We call it no one explained that better than Mao. So how is that different from Buddha's teaching? Buddha's teaching is a little bit different. It says, well, you have the stimulus, and if you want to have a certain result, you have to provide the condition. But keep in mind that once you have that result, it leaves a memory, a cosmic memory, a karmic memory, and that's what we call karma. The next time, this karmic seeds actually influence your thought process as much, if not more, than the outside stimulant. So when a person picks up a gun to kill someone who's looking for, someone of Asian origin, went into a massage parlor and started shooting, that didn't come because of the Chinese immigrant. That came because of the hatred in his mind. And he just happened to pick on some Chinese lady who's working for a living, as opposed to some other Arabic Americans or whatever. That hatred comes from within. That hatred is his karma. Right?
The three poisons,
Yeah.
Ill will.
Yeah.
That's
So
it.
the whole idea of what we call, I like it. I don't mind using the word heart mind, because what it does is that it opens up the discussion. Right? So I think that's we can come back to that. Okay,
That's right.
so
We can
you
knock
have
these
to ask
other
that.
ones.
Yeah.
Okay, we can knock these other ones out fairly quick.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention too, Denny mentioned about the basketball thing, and there's this documentary I have bookmarked to watch. It's by Michael Jordan. Anybody in the 90s know how amazing he was. It's called The Last Dance. It's a documentary kind of about his flow state and whatnot. So, okay, so here we have, we do these three, usually it's 5 breathing exercises, but in the evening,
Sometimes
Denny
I do only
does
2 now.
Okay. So yeah. So why is that? Because I feel that there can be a version of it, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
I actually I haven't seen Master Jiru for more than a year now. The last time I saw him was right after New Year, the what's the New Year in 2020, at the beginning of 2020, after he finished. Maybe sorry. It was actually at the end of 2019. He was rushing back to Maba to conduct the New Year ceremony. And so that was the last time I saw him. And I mentioned to him that I'm starting to have students who can only practice from a sitting position. And so he said he's going to think about that, on how to evolve the 5 breathing exercise into something that is suitable for those who are bounded to chairs. And so since that was the last conversation, I dare not to invent. That's one. The other one is that I try all 5 on the sitting position, and they're not that they don't feel right. And so I didn't want to introduce something that is. So this is one of the things that I try to do is and I think you even notice is that every week is a little bit different from the week before. And it's really because I really focus on the immediate effect. You know, like if I do something, I want to make sure that it has an effect and not just movement for movement's sake. And the reason is that every week, I guarantee every week more than half of the students are first-time students, maybe at least a third. And so this is the thing that we need to do is as much as we want to retain the returning students, we got to make it so that it's accessible to the new student. And so I thought this through, and I said, if I just blindly run through all 5, knowing that less than half of them are effective in a sitting position or immediately effective in a sitting position, that's not going to help a cause. And so that's why one reason is I did that to, just like, and the other thing I did is you notice that I always, I always use the word baseline. So I always, ask people to do a deep breathing exercise. I said, now remember that, we're going to do one more and then see how the improvement, this is the Sesame Street of mindful practice. You got to make it entertaining and accessible and measurable. Okay, this is my business head coming through. Okay,
and accommodating and dealing with all this juggling of all these different dynamics going on that Denny mentioned as well.
Yeah. So for now, actually, I even do. Sometimes I even just do 2. Just do the first one and the butterfly. That seems to work really well. And then I think as we progress, where we start to focus more on the metta, I think that's probably all the time we have anyway. Yeah. So that answers your question. Okay.
Now, the next one: how does one find energy points on the inside and outside of the legs? There's something we go along tapping on the insides and outside of the legs, and there's 3 different, at least. No, is there 6 on each inside and outside? But I'll just let you.
Okay, so let me generalize the question is that how does one find energy points, period? All right. Okay, so the easiest one, it turns out to be the governing vessel. So if you look at your spiral cord, this is the only energy lines where both the physical and the chi coincides. They're directly one-to-one. And all the pressure points are at the interface between the disc. So if you have to find the energy point for your governing vessel, that's easy. Okay. Now, everything else is not so obvious. And it's even different from person to person. And it can even be different from hour to hour. And so when an acupuncturist come find your energy points, he or she has to feel it. And I'm starting to, I know a lot of people who are really good at this, but even for me, I can feel it a little bit because now my mom's feet are swollen all the time, just from all kinds of reasons, and I need to give her massage on the energy points, the one in the inside that has to do with the splint, and I can feel it. I can just touch it. I can feel it because initially you feel a little bit of texture under the skin. And you can work on it and the texture goes away. And so you will find that a lot of these energy points, they're slightly different in I would say when you press it down, they feel different coming back. Okay, so a lot of these energy points has to do with some valley somewhere. And just let's look at what is energy point. What is energy point? What is this chi thing that we talk about? The chi is magnetic field. You see, our entire body has electrical field, right? The only time you don't have electrical field is when you're dead. And so that's why if you study your medicine from a cadaver, you will never find chi because there's no more electricity. Now, if there's electricity, there's the magnetic field. And so even if you have a very simple electrical pattern, like just blood traveling from your shoulder to your fingertip, it generates very complicated magnetic field. And I wrote a book. I actually wrote a book, and this I finally got my own copy. So this is the first book that I wrote many years ago. I wrote it when my son was born, and he's now 30, so that's a long time ago. And in there, I talks about electromagnetic field, talks about the Maxwell equations and all that. The one distinction between electrical field and magnetic field is that there is no source. There is no source for magnetic field. So the source has to be in the all magnetic field has to be in a circle. Has to go out and come back. Has to come. It has to. We call it. Well, I don't want to use a mathematical term, but the point is that if you look at a line for quote unquote magnetic field, it would have eventually find itself back because there's no source. There cannot be a source. Okay, whereas the electrical field is different. You can actually have an electron, a free electron, and generate electrical field, and it doesn't have to come back. So all magnetic field has to come back. So as a result, you have what is called dipole. So when you have even the simplest electrical field, it already generates very complicated magnetic field, and that magnetic field would have these dipole, what we call a dipole, where the magnetic field comes together and go out. Those are the energy point. Now think about how complicated your electrical field is, and therefore how complicated your magnetic field is. So jumping ahead, one of the questions is that I always point to this one and says, well, this is the energy point for the gallbladder. And by the way, your hip, when we do Yi Jing Jing, pointing to the Jiwan, pointing the Wan Tiao, that's another energy point for the gallbladder. And then now they runs along the question is that, wait a minute, how come it's so far away from the gallbladder? So number one, the energy field, the gallbladder are named after the energy field, not the other way around. So they discover the energy field, energy line. They discovered the correlation, the correlation between the body and the celestial, and how the tie. And because we're 75%, 75% water, so if it affects the tide, it affects us, right? So our body is actually affected by both the solar cycle and the lunar cycle, okay? And so they discovered these energy lines that eventually they said, well, there's 6 branches and then there's 8 main ones, okay? The 6 branches, the 12 branches, the 6 originated from the hand, and then 12 originated. 6 originated from the toes. 3 of them are yin and 3 of them are yang, because 3 are affected more by the sun and 3 are affected more by the moon. And all 12, each one is active for 2 hours. They discovered that first. Then they kind of named them, because it turns out that one has more to do with this particular function and one has to do with that particular function. Okay. Now, but again, this is a 2,000-3,000 years ago. And it's only I think it was less than 150 years when Western medicine started to come to China. Less than that. It was actually at the end of 19th century. So when they come to China, they understand these names of kidneys and so forth, and so they have the translation, and they say, oh yeah, we got something like that over here, and so they name kidney with that word, okay. But that doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one correspondence. So for example, the kidney is a very good example of how in the Chinese tradition, the kidney function is so much broader than just the mechanical function of a Western kidney, right? But and then the idea that you have to have yin and yang. And so, for example, I just talked about this morning in my Cantonese class that the splint is also responsible for the immune function, the lymph node, okay, and the lymph node is responsible for returning water back to your heart, and so the splint is a very important organ for controlling everything that has to do with water, like if you have a running nose, you have mucus in your lung, if you have swollen whatever. Okay, but the splint and the stomach is one pair. One is yin and one's yang. So you actually have to work on your splint energy line as well as the stomach energy line, because that's the yang line that complements the yin line. Now that kind of concept doesn't exist in the Western culture. It's a much, much deeper concept. And so this idea of this question of why this has to do with the gallbladder need to be asked the opposite way, which is now that you have an energy line, what do you name it after? And it turns out that they name it after the gallbladder because by working on this energy line that runs from the top, 100 meeting, all the way down to your shoulder, all the way down to your butt, all the way down to this has to do with that energy line has to do with the function of the gallbladder. Okay.
It's fascinating,
It is extremely fascinating. Yeah.
And it seems like Chinese medicine and this technique is more kind of like the original or one of the original holistic because it's not one thing can be considered really in isolation, right? And then also you have the dualistic thing of the yin and the yang interacting with all this holistic, systems as well.
Yeah. The problem with the word holistic is that most people think of holistic as non-scientific. Whereas holistic is really with the W, is the whole.
Yes.
That's the proper. As such as people think that Chinese medicine is the alternative medicine. No, the Western medicine is the alternative medicine. We've been here before.
And it blows my mind how these perceptions have already been, these I guess, unskillful perceptions and unhelpful perceptions have been built into the American, because we don't need to go into, how that happened or who that benefits, right? So, but yeah.
I think it's important for me to repeat, which is I am not against Western medicine. I myself is a diabetic. I take Western medicine, but I understand Western medicine, and I understand how medicines tend to treat symptoms. And I also understand that Western doctors are essentially salesmen. They're part of the distribution channel for the pharmaceutical industry, whether they like it or not, because the medical doctors is that one traditions where after they get out from medical school, the re-education in their entire career is controlled by the vendor.
And Denny and I have done a whole show on this too, so if anybody's interested, we can go back on this. And Denny and I see eye to eye on this, same way. I don't have anything particularly against, just more honesty, transparency around everything, yes.
I used to call I forgot what it's called. I used to have a very good, but the point is, be your own prime contractor. Be your own contractor. Be your own prime contractor for your own health, and treat everybody else as subcontractors. If the doctor wants to subscribe to you, I just find out that the medicine that my father was taking as a sleeping aid was actually a medicine that is meant to treat schizophrenic. It just happens to have the side effect that puts you to sleep. So I'm saying, what's going on here, right?
They can do off-label stuff, yeah.
Be your own prime contractor. Listen to everything, study everything, and expand your horizon. Understand the difference between Western approach and the Eastern approach, and try to find something that is work for you and your loved ones. That's all we're asking.
That's right. Okay. And remember, there's informed consent, so they're required to tell you the pros and the cons, and then you have a choice about what medicines are prescribed. You also have a right to a second opinion as well.
Yeah, and now I have been a prime contractor before, so I know what that means. When you're a prime contractor, don't argue with the subcontractor. If they're not right for you, just walk away. You don't need to win them. Okay, so don't go to a Western doctor and talk about supplement.
Very good point, Denny. Yes.
They don't believe in this. So why waste your energy arguing with a subcontractor? Okay. All right. What are some? Okay, now your turn.
Okay, yeah, what are some of Josh's practice experiences? That's me with Denny. So I'll just go through these briefly. So yeah, this is just some things I've noticed when practicing with Denny in this practice we've been talking about. My back adjusting during standing meditation, sometimes when we stand there, I'll notice just just after a few moments, a lot of times, how the back, there'll be tension held in parts of it, and then it just kind of naturally releases, and the spine kind of aligns more, just standing there in this. The microcosmic orbit, Denny goes into details on this technique, but I noticed for me recently,
I'll back off a little bit from that. Yeah, recently, yes.
oh, you have? So
Yeah.
for me, I noticed that it was just, when we're going up the spine, it goes, my attention and awareness goes up really quick, but then it's almost like I have to force down the awareness down the front, which I thought was
Yeah.
interesting.
I also kind of bring in the idea of being mindful of your body as opposed, in addition to being mindful of your mind. So the idea is that when you go up, you pay attention to your body, you bring your body with you, you adjust your posture, maintaining this thing called the one pillar supporting the sky, which means that you're actually leaning back a little bit, tuck in your chin, right? So this point is straight up, and so there's, you can draw a straight line between the two energy point, one on the very top of your head, not very top, but just in the back of that, and then the other one is the energy point between your sexual organ and the opening of your bowel, and you draw a straight line, and so that's how you maintain posture. Okay, so very important that. So as you breathe in, you focus, you start to walk up. That's why we call the wandering dragon chasing the pearl. You just walk up your spine, you adjust your spine, you're very mindful of your body, you're adjusting your body. And when you reach the top, and if you can, don't come down right away, just relax, right? Because this is something that we talk about, that when we talk about that in a minute on Anapanasati. Remember that there is a thing called sati. So as you relax, don't rush into the out breath right away. Just let the out breath comes naturally. And as you come down, be mindful of your mind. This is now the yin part. This is the parasympathetic nerve. And just let it drop, and visualize this glass of water with debris, or this lotus pond with debris, and just let it drop. Let it drop. Don't force it down. Don't force it down. Let it drop. Relax, and until it comes down to your dantian, then you kind of switch back, and you can either apply forces on your adrenal gland again, or just goes back straight up. Yeah.
Cool, that's really helpful. And just sitting here and doing that, why you
Yeah.
said that, because
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do is force it to sync with the out breath down, and until I'm completely more relaxed, that this is not going to happen. So just but then when it does happen, it syncs up. So
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, there's a little thing up. So when I do it, because I was taught by Master Yu, who taught it in terms of the wandering dragon tracing the pearl, is that as you breathe, it's a natural thing. You don't force it. You just you let the breath comes in, and that's the pearl, and so the pearl is rising on your spiral cord, and you're just chasing it. Just go up with it, and I even visualize when it goes up to the top of my head, it's like the dragon disappear into the cloud, and then it wander around, and then it comes back, and when I'm ready to breathe out again, it just follows. And then when it goes down to my abdomen, I make a 180-degree turn. Again, that's where I'm pausing. I'm just waiting for the in breath. And I even visualize the dragon, pushing his legs against my adrenal gland. That's what the master says. So I often skip that part where your proper sitting position is after you straighten up your spine. Okay, you actually should lean forward and then lean back without moving your hip. So you maintain pressure on the adrenal gland. Right?
and that's in a yogic sitting posture too. I've been instructed.
Oh yeah, they're all the
that
same.
way
They're
as
all.
well.
I mean,
Yep.
they all come from the same source anyway.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
I
the
mean,
next,
I just saw a video of a Cantonese speaking grandfather, 97 years old, who learned the Taoist Qigong, and when he was 57, he started learning when he was 57, and so he was practicing. You couldn't tell the difference between the Taoist Qigong from the Hatha Yoga.
wow, yeah,
You
wow.
know, I mean, of course they're different, but the idea is the same. Yeah.
That's right. A lot of them, yeah, they all intersect, interweave. So, going to the Yi Jin Jing practice, and Denny and I have done at least one show that addresses this, and it's cropped up on other ones. There's one move when it's often said to stab, in the shoulder. What occurred to me is it's also important to remove the dagger on this one too. So I just thought that.
I see, I see, I see.
So usually we're
I
focused
don't
on
know. I need to
stabbing.
go back to the videotape and see how Master does it.
Yeah.
Does he actually remove?
No, I don't know. Well, I mean,
Ah,
you have to. I mean, well, since your hands aren't sticking there, so I'm
uh-huh.
assuming that it might be a okay perception to when you move the hands this way. Not only are you stabbing with a dabber, but you're also removing it then because your hands. So I don't know.
So here's my because I've been watching his videotape, and also remembering the times that I was his attendant where he was teaching because he teaches a little differently every time anyway, and so I come to the interpretation that the I Ching Ching is really about generating electricity. It's really about acting, so again, if you go back to the Chinese medicine, they talk about the body consisting of, the bone, the muscle, the tendon, and all that, the marrow and all that, lots of parts. And every single one of them are piezoelectric. So when you look at him, so the one good example of when he do the cross, if you watch it again, he would do the cross, and then you would hear the crackling sound. You would hear the crackling sound. The crackling sound doesn't come from the part where he's stretching. It comes from when he's holding. Right? So he would stretch and then he will hold, and then when he holds, he hears the crackling sound. The crackling sound is the breaking of the stiction between the connective tissue and the underlying muscle. So when we say qi gong, what is about qi? Qi, when you have blockage of qi, is when that layer between the connective tissue and the underlying muscle or the underlying body parts are stuck. Are stuck because of either inflammation or somehow dehydrated. Okay, and so if you just watch him, he would stretch and then he holds, and then all of a sudden he go like this, right? And it's because that connective tissue is what we call it's both piezoelectric and viscoelastic. Viscoelastic means that all you have to do is hold it, and that material will creep. See, it's like if you take a piece of metal and you bend it, if you hold it, it will stay there. But if you take a piece of rubber and you bend it and you hold the force, you didn't even increase the force, just hold it, it creeps, it starts to sag. It just takes time. That's why it's called viscoelastic. And so I come to the recognition of my own interpretation that a big part of the Yi Jing has to do with the holding the force. Because that's when you generate electricity, and that's when you break the stiction between your connective tissue and the underlying structure. And so when you talk about the stabbing, usually what I teach is I ask people to open the shoulder and stab and hold and then release. So the release part is also very important. This is something that Master talk about over and over again. You got to stay for the duration of 2 breaths, because you have to energize the parasympathetic nerve. You have to go from the yang back to the yin. Right? You got to let your body recover from the stress hormone.
That's what I was going to say too. Is we are generating piezoelectricity. However, that's either going to be stored and then or discharged or used in a certain way. So that's what you just.
I have this crazy idea that the jump at the very end is to uniformly distribute the electricity.
Well, that's the same thing. Yeah, that's what I gathered as well. And you mentioned the crackling, and I've experienced this firsthand. The last retreat, I guess it was last summer. It was a small retreat out at Maba, and when we were doing I Ching Jing, it's just like, from what even the first over the hands, I could just hear crackling, and I was like, well, is that his knuckles popping? But it seems like it's more than that. From what you just said.
No, it's not his knuckle. It's really the shearing between what's called the myofascia the connective tissue of his muscle and the
Yes.
underlying muscle.
So when
Underlying.
when he uses his fist, I can audibly hear it. I know I've got
Yeah.
pretty good hearing, and I can
Yeah.
hear it really plain as day.
Yeah, yeah,
Especially
yeah.
when he turns it up a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, 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 yeah.
so
Sometimes he does it for effect.
that's right, right, because it gets their attention, and it gets
Yeah.
to
So
look. Oh, this
how
is
much time we
interesting.
have? How much
Yeah, I
time we have
know.
left?
So let's blow through this. It's
No,
like
how
20.
much time do we have?
Yeah, we probably ought to wrap it up here in about 10,
Okay,
under 15 minutes. So
okay, so
the heart opening one, I was just going to say real quick, with the tearing the phone book, I thought maybe that was, it's more like you're kind of like, or it's not more, but it's another perspective is you're opening my heart up here. So I thought
yeah,
that
yeah,
just came to me.
yeah.
And
Actually,
I'll skip the other one.
I spent a little bit more time on the Chinese original Chinese description of these two moves. So the one where you like the bar and you're lifting your head up. So that's made out of two words. The first word is up, and the second word is goi, which is another way of saying the head. So you're lifting your head.
Yeah.
That's one. Then the second one, which is the first word is lower, so it distinguishes from the upper and the lower. The second word of that is when you release the arrow. It's the same word that we use for releasing an arrow. So sometimes I use the phone book just for fun. The phone book analogies for fun, but the more accurate one is the one that Master uses, which is you pulling the arrow.
I remember that.
You
Yeah,
have a
because you're
bow on the
pulling
side.
it back and then
Yeah, you're
releasing
pulling
it.
it back
Right?
because that word meant to release the arrow.
That makes sense. And I won't. You go, the last one was I don't know if this is advisable or not. So please call me out, or anybody call me out if it's okay. It was just basically using this Yi Jing as kind of like an energy practice. So you put certain intents into what you're doing, especially at the end, to whatever you want to accomplish energetically. Now, I don't know if that's advisable or wise, but maybe that's a topic for another time. So we'll move on here. Any miscellaneous views, observations, and questions? So why is this? Okay, we already addressed this, the first one about the gallbladder, about why it's certain places and not just so we went into that in depth. I just wanted to share some other things. On the thing where at the end of the Yi Jing, when the arms are going up the side like this is where my 6-year-old niece says, "You look like a chicken when you do that." And I just thought that was so funny. Not only that, because this is also used in like a preliminary to Kung Fu, right? And so here's my kind of niece, poking and prodding at me, making fun a little bit.
How about we make this the last slide?
Okay.
Because I have more, but I think that could be a standalone show. That's the stuff that I added could be a standalone show because I
That's
think
right.
we need to explain some of that here.
Yes.
Okay, so
the next
there-
one
the-
here. Well, go
yeah,
ahead.
so the one you about the chicken, actually a lot of the moves in the Yi Jing find its way into different styles of martial art. So like the spirit boosting palm, you see that all over the place. This one you see it all over the place. So actually you come up the finger. Actually, Master talks a lot about the finger and how you're supposed to be like this. You're supposed to like this, and you come up like this. Okay, so this is actually, if you are translated literally, it means hip is the underarm, and the next word is more important, is that you're raising the energy. So it's like you're raising the energy. Now, of course, we don't do it right. I don't do it right, so I don't get the effect. But on the other hand, this style, this thing, you see it in many martial art. Yeah, in many. So this part is actually quite important. That looking like a chicken one is actually quite important. But Master did elaborate on how your hands has to be like this. I don't know if I could turn it right. So it's like you're holding, it's like holding a chopstick sort of, and then you just lifted your energy. Now, but of course, I'm not to a point where I can feel the energy for the same reason that when you swallow the dan, I don't feel it yet. That comes from years and years of training.
And that's even, with people's practices so deep, just the subtle changes of mudras for some practitioners can have a significant energetic effect when you're at that level. So I hear, right? So yeah I'm obviously not there either. So moving on here to the next one, and this is interesting. Denny and I, or Denny especially, have talked about anapanasati. And just one other thing that I heard recently, I thought was interesting, is the pana part of anapanasati is supposedly what I've heard is the Pali word for the Sanskrit word prana. And prana, as the yoga practitioners know, this is kind of like similar to the word chi, right? The life force energy, but breath, because there's what the limb in yoga that just deals with specific controlling of breath exercises. It's called, I'll remember it here in a second. But so I just thought that was an interesting thing that I heard, that it's actually dealing with the kind of, not just the in and out, but also just the kind of energy, the breath energy that comes along with it, and energy circulation in the body, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're the same word, but I definitely believe that they're related. But going back to the word anapanasati, it's actually made out of three words. The last one is sati, that's mindfulness. Then you have pana, then you have anapana. So the A is always the opposite. So if the pana is out, then the A prana would be in, or vice versa, right? So that's actually is actually, in that sense, it's actually two words. It's the breathing, and it's the mindfulness. And whatever you interpret the breathing as either in and out, then the A is the opposite of that, right? It's the opposite of that.
So it would be, but A negates the na then? Or does it negate both the pana too? Or, is it ana and then
Hey,
a?
you're the expert in Pali.
That's
Come
right.
on.
No. Real
How
quick
am I
comment.
supposed to know? But
Real
it
quick
does
comment on Pali.
talk about three things:
Yes,
in
sati
breath,
we all
out
are in
breath,
agreement with.
and
Yep.
then mindfulness, right? Okay,
Trying to
so
set,
with the remaining time, I
yeah.
do want to talk about the last one, is that yoga and meditations as connections to Buddha, his teaching and practice. I talked about this last week. It's important to remind ourselves that Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew. Not only that, he was a rabbi. Because once you understand that, then you go back to the history and you understand that the social political dynamics of his time. Only then you would understand his teaching, right? So, by the same token, it's important to understand that the historical Buddha, right? Buddha is actually not his name; is his title. The historical Buddha was a North Indian. He was a yogi. Not only that, but he was what we call a Aryan. He's an Aryan, meaning that he's actually European. So his people came from Europe, the sort of the what we call now the eastern part of Europe, and because of climate change, they have to move down. And so they not only went to India, they also went to Persia, and they also went to Egypt. And so they became the ruling class. That's why they have lighter skins. Okay, so the Indians who are darker skins, actually on a DNA level, is very similar to the natives from Australia. Okay, so this is before the continent split. Okay, so they're very different people. They have very different belief. Their belief is that there was once upon a time a god named Shiva, who is one of the three gods. Okay, and the other two, one is called Brahma or Brahman. Shiva is called the Adi Yogi, the original yogi. And so Shiva was the one that actually started the practice. And all yogis learned from that lineage. Okay. Now, earlier I talked about Sati, who was the name of a princess. But before that, she was actually the goddess. And so when after she jumped into the fire, she reincarnated. She went back to her goddess status, and then she became the second wife of Shiva. She was also the first female student of Shiva. And Shiva actually taught, I believe it's called Parvati now, but it's the Shiva, it's Sati of the different name, that we have, I believe we have 72,000 energy lines. The body consists of 72,000 energy lines, half of them on the right, half of them on the left. And that it has, as these energy lines comes together, they form what's called chakra, which is just translated into a wheel, the wheel of the energy line. Because even though when they meet, they form a triangle, but as the energy emanate from that, it becomes a circle, a wheel. And so Shiva taught Parvati or Sati that there are 114 chakras, and every one of them is a point of entry for your enlightenment. Okay, and out of that 114, Shiva says that 4 of them is actually outside the body, and so there's only 100 and there's only I misspoke. Anyway, there's 100 and so out of that there's 112. So maybe 2 of them I forgot the exact, but I do remember that there's, and then out of 112, 4 of them you don't need to work. So if you can discover one of the 108, then the other 4 would come naturally. So there's really 104, and so it's an increment of 7. So from the 104, it becomes 21, and from the 21, it becomes 7. And so right now, when we talk about the current yogi practice, is about the 7 chakras, but it's actually part of the 108 and 114. Now, Buddha, the historical Buddha, as a yogi, discovered one of those. So his entire practice is based on that one chakra. And that chakra has to do with the recognition of how the brain and the spiral cord works together. Okay, so in Buddha's teaching, it always comes back to equanimity. And the opposite of equanimity would be any number of words, would be differentiating, discernment. Where you separate you from the rest of the universe. And so this is really, as a human being, this is our identity. Our identity is in fact the source of all our suffering. And so in Buddha's teaching, it talks about how the identity is actually part of your brain. Okay, that's why we talked about earlier why so many people are drawn into being a volunteer, because through the volunteering process, they're now separating their brain from the rest of their central nervous system. They no longer judge. They don't judge. Right? So this is actually the Bodhisattva way. Is that I always explain to my parents, I say, look at Bodhisattva, look at Guan Yin. Her eye never look at you. Her eye is always looking on the ground, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who she is. So there's so many different ways of explaining that. You can think of the brain as something that is very exclusive, because that's what we do. We wake up in the morning, the first thing we say is, who is me? This is me. That's not me. Right? Whereas the spiral cord is very inclusive.
Now, Denny and I have talked about this last point, and we've shared information on it as well. And I still, if Denny could send me if there's any kind of detailed teaching on all these different chakras, what list I did find is all these different ways that Shiva has recommended for potential methods of enlightenment, and how the Buddha only focused on one of these methods of enlightenment. However, I think that his method supersedes all those, because I think if I'm getting this right, I actually haven't studied Hinduism as much as that. They don't. Well, I guess there is, but the Buddha seemed to go beyond levels of gods. He went beyond all of that even. Even though I guess they might have been enlightened, they still have these status of a god. But I think that's not accurate either, because there's. They say some people say that the Buddha was a avatar of, or one version of Vishnu, but that's besides the point. I wanted to, so maybe we'll include some links. I plan to include the link of the different Shiva things.
I think this is we're so beyond our depth here.
That's true. Yeah. So if
Yeah.
Denny finds a link
But
on that, I'll include
I
that.
think we talk about it because it's really a great source of curiosity.
It is
Right.
right.
And
The
so I think it suffices to just remind ourselves that the historical Buddha was a yogi.
That's right, and that's the point I
Yeah.
wanted to circle back to here.
Yeah.
But equanimity, though, for me, another way is just not being entangled. You know, being active and living in the world, but not being of the world. So we might have identities, but we're not entangled with these identities, right? We're
Well,
not
this is
identifying
again.
with the identity.
This is the idea is similar to what we said earlier about being your own prime contractor,
That,
right? Because think about it, right? Because all these years of development of spiritual practice was done in a time where communications were very expensive. I mean, to learn from a different teacher means that you might have to walk, thousands of miles, and then even you might not find the person.
now we take it for granted.
And then if you don't visit that teacher, there's very difficult ways of learning it from a book, because books are very expensive, right? And also, how do it's learning is very difficult. Absorbing knowledge is very difficult. Getting access to information is very difficult. That has been the case for thousands of years, and that's why you get all these silos. Everybody who comes to a class says, "Is this qigong?" And then I have to explain to them that, well, let's not put ourselves into this silo called qigong.
Yeah.
Okay, because silo means something very specific to somebody. On the other hand, qigong with the hyphen just means the practice of qi, so that's what we do.
Yes.
Then the next question is that, well, is this Tai Chi or is it no? Because we're so used to be put into these
Sure.
silos. And my message to everyone here is that be your prime contract, be your own prime contractors. Break down these walls.
Yes.
And with understanding that everything comes back potentially to a single source. Now, in this case, I'm proposing that Shiva might be the single source, but maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
That's
doesn't
right.
matter. It really
right.
doesn't matter. Be
The
open
important-
mind. Be open
Because
mind.
because
Yeah.
often we'll put a label on something, then we think we know everything about it. There's
Well,
nothing.
because putting a
Right.
label on something is the prerequisite of intellect.
That's right. Yeah. So they can be
And
helpful.
so
but
now
we also
you're
don't know
you're
when they
you're
let go of them.
you're permanently
That's
pigeonholed into this one path, and you completely forgot that the other path, which is experience. And if you want to, in order to experience means that you have to be very open mind.
That's right. So the original point I was trying to make with this, or the thing that occurred to me, even though, let's say that the yoga practice of today, even just the asana practice, if that has any semblance to what the Buddha, the environment that he was in, well, then there's some kind of connection today that we can have with a yoga practice of what his environment was like. Even though, from what I remember, there's no mention of asana practice. However, the jhana, the two teachers that taught different jhana practices, we do know that there is a limb of yoga that deals with types of meditation like that. So he was in that environment according to the writings. And also, he did give detailed instructions on anapanasati. So when we practice that, it's just kind of like a living link to that time period and also that experience, and which brings it back into another point that Denny mentioned, that learning is difficult. However, we're just taught certain ways of learning. What we're not usually taught in school is the meditation practice, which is a whole nother level of how to open up the mind and integrate other knowledge and see different layers of it, and also opens up new perspectives, and it gives an experiential experience of different types of information that we've learned about before. It can bring in new. So this is a level of mind and practice and information that most people don't get to experience because they don't have a meditation practice, right? And I feel that maybe sometimes a lot of people are drawn to drugs because some of these drugs can simulate kind of like the reverse versions of some of the states and experiences that meditation give as well, you know?
Okay. I think we should wrap it up. What do you
Yes.
think?
Very good, yes.
We've done
Good.
enough damage, haven't we?
And enough good for today.
Okay, with that, thank you for joining us. We do have quite a few people out there watching. If you like, you can send us a chat, whether on YouTube or Facebook, just to say hi. Or if you have a questions for us, you're welcome to do that. Okay.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you. See you. See you.
Practice.
See you on Saturday, and we'll do this again next month.
That's the plan. Oh, I don't know about that. Well, yeah, there'll be a different topic more than likely. But yeah.
All right. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Denny. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.